Over the past few years, the indie scene has grown in popularity and become known to many gamers as the oasis for innovation and creativity when it comes to the video game industry. But if AAA game studios spend so much money, time and resources making their games look like the woman in the red dress, then why aren't these ugly, pixelated, retro-looking indie games, and just indie games in general, dead and buried? Especially when you contemplate that with just a few clicks on a PC, or a few button taps on a current-gen console controller, or even a smartphone, any gamer can have immediate access to AAA video games with stunning cinematic visuals and super realistic graphics made by hundreds of developers. So why is it that gamers are still buying and playing both popular and obscure indie games, which in many instances have low budget development costs and a lot of the time minimalistic, stylized or pixelated graphics? You see, when it comes to indie games, they don't often conform to the expectations mainstream AAA video games have set in terms of gameplay. Indie developers very often being a single or a few individuals making games in their bedroom or in their mom's basement have complete control and full creative freedom to create and develop any game or idea they can think of. Human beings are creative by nature, and based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm not sure if I agree with entirely, humans at their core have a basic need for self-actualization. Some humans satisfy this need by expressing themselves through various forms of artistry such as painting or making music, etc. And some indie developers satisfy this need by making games. After all, what are video games if not works of art made up of multiple works of art and skills? Throughout the mid to late 2000s, AAA video game development studios created, or one could say discovered, formulas that worked for mainstream video games. Those formulas at the time were great, and you could argue that they still are. They were fresh and new experiences for gamers to dive into and take part in. And as time went by, companies like Ubisoft, Activision and EA reused those formulas until they became overused and stale. Up until this day, they continued to find success by repackaging reskins and reselling those very same formulas, albeit with graphical improvements, bloated maps, same old gameplay, bug infestations, and little to no evolution or innovation on the original formula. Most of the developers that work at the said companies probably have the same skill set and qualifications as a lot of indie developers, but the major difference behind the games they both work on, apart from the budget and overall operation, is the person who's in charge of leading the direction of the project, the person with the creative vision. You see, human creativity can be influenced by things such as emotions, personal experiences and what we know, as well as cultural parameters. So the wide range of indie developers are naturally gonna create and release a large number of games that contain a mixture of new and old gameplay concepts and ideas influenced by their individuality. Hence, as a mathematical result, some of those games and ideas are gonna stick and blow up like a sticky bomb, while at the same time a great portion of those indie games are gonna fall into the deep abyss of obscurity and never see the light of day. In my opinion, the fun factor of a video game lies at the very core and essence of a video game, or in other words, the fun in a video game comes primarily from the gameplay mechanics, systems, AI and physics before the graphics and art style. During Breath of the Wild's development, a 2D prototype of the game was made which contained a lot of the same gameplay systems as the 3D version and final product. The ideas within the test build were simply transferred to another gameplay perspective because the 2D prototype was made in the same 3D plane and engine as the final version. The point I'm making is that the game was already fun and interesting before it was 3D, with the gigantic open world and cel-shaded art style Breath of the Wild fans know and love. You don't have to look closely to realize that the 2D prototype significantly resembles a modern indie game, and if the 2D prototype was kept 2D, only fully fleshed out as a full game and reskinned as a new indie IP and was sold as an indie game, while it probably wouldn't be as popular, I would argue that it would still be just as fun. And so, because indie devs often take a similar approach to experiment and test their games and just try out new things in general, indie games a lot of the time tend to be more refreshing experiences for avid gamers than their AAA counterparts who seem reluctant to try and test new ideas and gameplay concepts in similar ways. Nowadays, thanks to the significant improvements in technology and platforms like Steam and social media, it is simpler and easier than ever before for indie developers to get their games out there. With social media platforms, you name it, an indie developer can say, "Hey everyone, this is what I've been working on lately," and make posts showing everyone exactly what they've been working on, whether it's a character or an animation, and gamers can indirectly be a part of and influence the development process of indie games. As to whether this is a good or bad practice is up to the developer, I would say. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was a lot harder for indie developers to get their games into the hands of gamers, with distribution methods and driving brand awareness being a lot more tedious, time consuming, and and not to mention economically unviable for many indie devs. Thanks to the emergence of the internet and platforms like Steam, the indie scene has been able to flourish and become what it is today. These days, most people have a mini computer in their pocket, aka a smartphone. Heck, you're most likely watching this on a mini computer yourself. Back in the 70s, computers costed thousands of dollars and they definitely couldn't fit in your pocket. Right now, an indie dev or even you can start making a game and finish it without ever touching a laptop or a desktop computer. Ease of access is a major reason why indie games are still alive and kicking, and that's just the first thing indie devs can easily access. There are tons of websites like UnrealEngine.com, and no, this isn't an ad, that offer broke and rich indie developers tons of free assets, plugins, animations, sound effects, music, etc. to use in the development of their games and bring them to life. Indie devs no longer have to spend as much time making those parts of the game and can spend more time focusing on the most important part of the game, that being the gameplay in my opinion. Although in most cases, the game will stand out from competition and be more unique if they spend the time and or resources to make their own, rather than using assets hundreds if not thousands of other indie devs end up using in their games. AI can also assist in every part of the creation process, but indie devs offering their individuality and unique perspective being the heart and driving force of the fun factor and innovation is a valuable asset to the games that they make. Unlike AI, human creativity allows indie devs to think outside of the box due to the fact that human creativity isn't restricted to a predefined set of rules enforced by lines of code and limitations of software. This grants small devs the advantage to try and explore possibilities neither AI nor out-of-touch billion-dollar game companies may have not considered. Indie games being made by people who collectively have a vast number and wide range of life experiences tend to touch on themes, stories, personal issues and topics that many AAA games don't, and gamers also collectively having a vast number of life experiences in many cases may be able to relate on a personal level to these stories and themes. As a result, gamers may continue to seek out more indie games based on themes that they find interesting or just simply have a connection to. When indie games get released, rarely do you ever hear a large number of gamers complaining about broken indie games. That's because indie devs know that if they don't take the extra time to make sure that their game is playable and meets a certain standard, their hard work will be for nothing at all because gamers simply won't put up with that. Whereas on the other hand, AAA studios that release broken games are usually able to fix and correct issues, bounce back and reclaim some of their integrity like CD Projekt Red with Cyberpunk and Hello Games with No Man's Sky. Although some AAA studios never recover and end up shutting down or being dissolved into other parent company studios like Volition, the makers of Saints Row 2022, and Luminous Productions, the makers of Forspoken respectively. Compared to AAA games, indie games usually cost significantly less than their AAA counterparts. Hence, when they go on sale on digital platforms like Steam, they end up being dirt cheap and gamers are given more incentive to try a new game. Sometimes when this happens, gamers end up enjoying their time with an indie game and recommend it to a friend, or maybe on a forum, or perhaps maybe even by chance a popular streamer starts playing it on their platform of choice, and tons of gamers end up seeing it, causing the indie game to spiral into success. The price to value proposition is important to most gamers, and some indie games end up getting played for dozens and sometimes hundreds of hours by gamers all around the world. This causes the indie scene to become the place to look when it comes to bang for buck sometimes. Team Cherry released Hollow Knight all the way back in 2017. Now Hollow Knight is nothing less than a masterpiece if you ask a lot of gamers like myself, and in that same year, even the exact same month, February of 2017, Guerrilla Games released Horizon Zero Dawn, one of the best looking games of the 8th console generation, with stunning visuals and a vast open world. Yet still, at the time of recording, more than 5 years after their initial release dates, which are exactly 4 days apart, Hollow Knight has more than double the amount of active players on Steam, and if you ask me, that is just crazy and at the same time amazing. Isn't that amazing? Especially considering that they aren't live service games or anything like that. There's so much modern AAA game studios could learn from indie developers and indie games. It's not just about copy and pasting what indie games have done, it's more about the philosophical approach and guiding principles that were used to create successful indie games. I personally think that indie game devs that are gamers themselves try to think about what they find to be fun in a video game and also take inspiration from games they've enjoyed themselves. Even though many modern AAA games in recent years have been frowned upon, video games overall and especially indie games are still in their infancy. Humans have been making guns for hundreds of years, but the first home video game console, was only released in the 1970s, and since then the technological leaps have been crazy. And now with the uprise of AI tools, procedural generation, hyper-realistic visuals, VR and AR, and just the general improvements in technology as a whole, the indie scene is only going to continue to improve as well and spit out some unbelievably stunning games, not only necessarily in terms of visuals, but they might make some gamers look back at games they've loved over the years and call them trash. Until next time, I'll be enjoying some indie games.